get into the mode. I mean, I drank a bunch of beer last night and listened to a shitload of Wagner, just like old times. And man, the thing is I was trying to think of an analogy. Listening to Wagner is like drinking maple syrup. It really is. You listen to a lot of are you into classical music at all?
Very little. Very little. Although there's some Wagner that I like Tannhauser.
I mean,
I like.
Tannhauser's great. I mean, he's definitely top tier, no doubt about it. You know, he's up there with Beethoven, Mozart, Ellington, Davis, Ives. He's top tier in terms of like artistic output and its relevance. There's just no avoiding that. I'll give a little like music appreciation style because I was gonna walk through his whole bio, but it's a bit much. I gotta say.
Yeah.
But I'll after we do that, we'll get to he dies. 5 years later, Hitler is born. 12 years after that, Hitler gets his first experience with Wagner, and then we'll take it from there. But
okay.
I got two hilarious things, man. So fucking funny. So first thing, not gonna get into exactly like how and why, but Wagner's constantly broke. And Germany is not unified at this time, right? So this is a German state. But when the new king of Bavaria takes the throne, he's 18 years old, and he's a homosexual, and he loves Wagner. He loves his music, and Wagner basically I don't know what's the word for it. He leads this kid on, right? He pretends to reciprocate feelings, basically. Yeah. and it works because my boy gets to come back home and the king pays his debts, and the king will be helping him out a lot throughout his whole life when he's, caught very publicly banging somebody who ate his wife. like the guy was a real piece of shit, man.
He really was.
The other funny thing, though, because we're gonna have to talk about his article that's reprinted twice called it's usually translated as Judaism in music. I think it's probably more proper to translate it as either Jewry in music or Jewishness in music, because it's a little more crude than just.
It's the Judentum, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
like Jewry
or
Jewishness.
Your German is probably going to be way better than mine in this episode, but in any case, the thing is the first time he prints it, almost no one reads it, and he uses a pseudonym. Do you know what his pseudonym was, bro? It's fucking hilarious.
No, what was it?
Let me give it to you in the German first. Hang on. I'll do my best. K Frigadank, or we might translate it as Kid Free Thought. like a man's fucking shit posting under the name K Free Thought. All right. So in this article, like it's basically all about two guys that aren't Wagner, Giacomo Meyerbeer and Felix Mendelssohn, both of whom are more successful and prosperous than he is, both of whom are Jewish, and both of whose they're all romantic composers, broadly speaking, in the music appreciation sort of term that I'd put it. But Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer are of a more conservative style than Wagner will end up being, which is odd because like Wagner politically and personally is a giant reactionary piece of shit. But musically, he's actually on the more innovative side, which is one reason why he's so top tier. The other thing about that article that fucking blew my mind is that he writes it, and like I said, almost no one reads it the first time, and it's under a pseudonym. Like the guy got actually kind of lucky. he it could have just like not been a thing that people remembered him for.
Right.
But he reprints it about 20 years later in 1869, and at this time, he's already written Lohengrin. He's already written Tristan in the Solde, which are the latter of which is in the top 10 most important pieces of music ever composed in terms of its impact on the state of music today, I'd say. And you're just gonna have to take my word for it as we School Dropout on that. But so he's like feeling his oats now, and it's basically the same shit, but a lot of the he's a lot more assertive, turgid, vituperative, virulent. I mean, he's a huge dick. I don't know if you've read this thing at all or if you're familiar with it.
I've read excerpts of it. I haven't read the whole thing.
Although the peculiarities of the Jewish mode of speaking and singing come out of the most glaringly in the commoner class of Jew, who has remained faithful to his father's stock and through the cultured sin of Jewry takes untold pains to strip them off. Nevertheless, they shew an impertinent obstinacy in cleaving to him. Like he thinks Jewish people, because of who they are, their immutable characteristics,
right,
can't be real musicians. Not really.
Right. Yeah. So it's like it comes from this idea that and it's one that Hitler really picks up on. Obviously, it's that Jews are they don't have a culture of their own. Instead, they live in other people's cultures and they adopt those cultures as a means of destroying them. There's no creativity among Jews.
And there's a really there's one instance where he basically damns with faint praise of a very popular Jewish composer because German music itself is so devoid of its pure nationalist essence that it is an imitation of itself, and therefore there is no better creature than the Jew, who is himself a fake, to perpetuate that tradition, which is like some really fucking bonkers reasoning. I should talk a little bit about Wagner as a composer too. I suppose. Like I said, in terms of music appreciation style 101, he would be described as a late romantic. He was incredibly influential. Even people who hated him, nonetheless, always would be within his shadow. Claude Debussy called him a poison, and yet was inevitably influenced by him musically. He begins to basically bump up against the limits of the tonal system. His work is characterized by a lot of chromaticism, sometimes very sweeping walls of sound, extensive use of dynamics. As a musician and a conductor, he does a lot of innovative stuff that today we would probably frown upon a lot, where he basically would just rewrite scores a bit to make them better. But he did pioneer the idea that the conductor is more than a mechanical instrument for orchestral unison and can actually be a conduit through which creativity is expressed, which is something that this is how we view and teach conducting today. Again, you're just gonna have to take my word for that. The other thing I'll say about his legacy is that he's primarily known as an opera composer, and he's unique in that he also wrote the libretto, that is the text to his operas. Most operatic composers, Mozart did not do this. The librettist is almost always someone separate. So he has some talent as a writer, and in addition to libretto, like will also write on politics and music a lot, especially in his later days in a really like shitty way. But other than that, I'll let most things. There is one more thing I forgot. Because people are going to want to know. Yes, he was an anti-Semite, and he was a virulent one, and it wasn't a passive thing. He was active in his anti-Semitism and sort of spreading it as a cause, especially like later in his life. Although he did have an ambivalent sort of relationship with some Jews in his personal life. However, what people probably really want to know is, in his operas, is his work anti-Semitic? And the answer to that is mostly no. I would say.
Right.
I don't know if you've looked into this at all or if you know anything about it, but most Wagner scholars, I mean, there are a few characters and a few scenarios where you can stage the production or view it in such a way as to be critical of Jews or Jewry, and this is very true. But it's not really there in a pervasive way, systematic way, and it's definitely not in all his operas for sure. That being said, we'll revisit his operas and where they can and can't be performed. But all that being said, Wagner dies, like I said, and 5 years later, Thames Darwin's hero, Adolf Hitler, was born. So, and in Mein Kampf,
Ralphie.
Yeah. And I'm gonna quiz you, bro, because you're my expert.
Okay.
Let's see how.
All right.
Do you know who sent Hitler care packages, including stationery, upon which his autobiography was written? Do you know among those who did so, the Wagners?
Yeah.
So they're in early in the 20s. Wagner's descendants are already helping Hitler. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler describes a performance that he saw of Lohengrin at the age of 12. And he fucking loves it. Oh my God, he loves it so much, bro. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Don't remember him being 12. I didn't think that he had gone to, he had seen Wagner until he was living in Vienna when he was like 17. But I mean, I could be wrong.
Let me check.
But
go ahead though.
Yeah, no, but it's like, so the whole period that he's in Vienna is kind of this the way that he describes it, at least, is like a time where he's being kind of pulled in different directions by different forces. And on the one hand, like, he sees Vienna as this really cosmopolitan city where there's tons of ethnic minorities, and they're kind of polluting the purity of the Austrian state. And he sees in Wagner in particular, like, this positive assertion of German identity, German myth making, and like a renunciation of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism, basically, and sort of like this reification of what it means to be a German. And so it lends itself for a person like Hitler, and for a lot of people in Austria at that time, in Vienna in particular, who were on the right. A pan-German identity, the idea that to be German was to supersede your geopolitical identity.
I just wanted to say that I did look. Quote: this is from Mein Kampf. Quote: at the age of 12, I saw the first opera of my life, Lohengrin. In one instant, I was addicted. My youthful enthusiasm for the Bayreuth master knew no bounds. End quote. Bayreuth, of course, is a place in Germany today, and it is actually an opera house that still stands. The war did destroy the Wagners' like primary residence, but it did not wreck the theater, which is probably good because it's hard to build an opera house, and I'd rather not wreck them. But I also wouldn't cry too hard if a few bombs had blown it up.
Yeah,
because Bayreuth is gonna come back. Because Bayreuth's still going. It's been up and down, but it was started after Wagner's death. He was the first director, of course, and passed it on through his family, and it still operates today. There was a hiatus, of course, after Germany lost the war for a few years. But in terms of Wagner's influence on Hitler's anti-Semitism, though, this is basically not a thing. I want to make clear that people, even the second time that Wagner's article gets out, is more popular, but it's not that popular. And we really don't have any evidence that Nazi party functionaries in the 20s and 30s were like really into Wagner a whole bunch, with the exception of Hitler.
Yeah.
There are actually stories of like Hitler being super into Wagner and inviting all these Nazi party functionaries to see a Wagner opera, which, like, I gotta tell you guys, they're beautiful works of art, but if you know anything about opera, they're long as shit. And so you are talking about like a multi-hour commitment to sit in a chair and shut the fuck up and listen. And I mean, that's not something that's easy for anyone to do. And to be honest with you, like, though Wagner was pretty successfully appropriated by the Nazis, he was not that popular a composer at the time. Like, I think Puccini was bigger during the war than Wagner really was in people's houses. But in any case, like, Hitler invites people to go to this opera, and like the first time, basically, like, none of the Nazis show up. And so the next year he says the same thing, except this time, like, no, you're going. No, I'm not. You don't understand. I'm not inviting you. I'm telling you that you will go. Yeah. And it's very clear that you got to go. And he was pretty pissed off that like people were like sleeping in their chairs or whatever, and they were. And so the year after that, he finally released more tickets like to the public and stopped trying to like fucking boost it so much.
Yeah.
But all that being said, just because like I do hold Wagner, yeah, he was an anti-Semitic piece of shit, but he was really a Nazi. And he was, he was bad for his time too. He wasn't just like, oh, everyone was kind of racist. No, he was famous for being a dick about this stuff, like when he was alive.
Right.
And yet, when he dies, when a person dies, I'm inclined to stop pinning things on them quite so easily. And because what really happens is, like, his music, like I said, it's not really anti-Semitic in itself, but fascism is a postmodern thing. It's not interested in this. It's going to appropriate what it wants. It's going to appropriate the ambivalent things and then mold them to their purposes, and then everything else it will discard. And this is what they did with Wagner. A lot of Wagner's operas were not performed during the Nazi era. I don't think Parsifal was performed much at all because it has themes in it that might offend Nazis.
Yeah.
But the real kind of, villain here, if you will, is another Wagner, though, right? You know this Wagner. Winifred Wagner, I believe was her name. She's originally a Suffolk-born English woman who married into the family. But she became incredibly close to Adolf Hitler. How much do you know about their relationship?
Well, I know that she married Siegfried, I think.
Yes.
And he was actually, I think, managing Bayreuth during that period.
Yeah,
like, and managing the festival.
When he died in, I believe, 1930, Winifred, the widow, became the festival's director.
Right. And she was the one that was sending the stationery to Hitler in prison, wasn't she? So more than one of Wagner's children are deeply problematic in this regard. Like, a lot of people tend to point the finger more at the older daughter, Eva, who's she's the daughter that he has by Franz Liszt's daughter.
Yes.
And she marries. She also marries a British guy. His name's Houston Stewart Chamberlain.
Yeah, and he writes a number of quote unquote
very influential books on race.
Yeah, you might, they were called philosophic, but they're not. They're garbage, of course. But they were required Nazi reading, so he's on the fucking list.
Yeah, and so there's a good argument to be made that writers like Chamberlain had a pretty significant effect on, or influence rather, on Hitler's theories about race. Like, for all of his anti-Semitism, Wagner didn't have a very sort of well developed theory or ideology about race per se. It was just who was German and who wasn't. And he was sort of part of a larger swath of German intellectuals on the right who were coming up during this period, who saw Jewish liberation as a very particular economic threat, right? So the like liberalism in Germany, it coincides with the granting of full citizenship to Jews, and within a generation or so, Jews are now able to, particularly, in fact, almost entirely in urban areas, they're able to compete economically for positions in universities, for white collar jobs, so on and so forth. So it's very easy to sort of turn these people's animosity toward Jews because they're posing a kind of economic threat.
Yeah, I just want to interrupt and butt in for 1 second because I forgot to say this. A lot of Wagner's anti-Semitism really is rooted in just like, I mean, for him, it's not petty bullshit. But in terms of world history, it's petty bullshit. What he is he's jealous of Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer, and he is associating their Jewishness both with their success and his own failure, and the fact that he views them as being too conservative and holding back the progress of music in general, German music in particular. And the last point, honestly, I'd say he's probably right about. Mendelssohn is too conservative for me, and I am glad that there was somebody like musically speaking who will bust open that shit. But everything else is really like a lot of right wingers. It's all just based on like personal resentment.
Yeah, no, there's no question about that. I mean, I think what happens during Wagner's period is that because there's been drawn a really clear separation between religious belief and government policy, and because you have a growing number of people who are not affiliated with the church and who are basically agnostic, if not outwardly atheistic, you can't drum up hatred against Jews on the basis of whatever role they're believed to have played in Christianity. Now, the line has to be drawn in some way that doesn't take religion into account. And so the way that the anti-Semite of mid to late 19th century Germany is going to do that is on the basis of quote unquote race, right? I mean, they're posing now this economic threat, and the way to deal with that threat is to point out to the larger community that they're not German, right? They come from someplace else. They look different from us. That if they practice a religion, it tends to be a religion different from ours, but that's a sort of a secondary concern. The irony of this, of course, is that a guy like Felix Mendelssohn considers himself to be entirely German. He doesn't feel as if he's fundamentally different from any other person that speaks German, that was lives in Germany, was born in Germany for that matter.
And I mean, yeah. And musically speaking, he absolutely was of the milieu of romantic German composers. I didn't mean to like slag on him too hard. I just, musically speaking, the only point I meant to say was like, I do prefer Wagner to Mendelssohn, and yet Mendelssohn still, this is just a matter of taste. Mendelssohn also top tier, very important, very influential composer in the history of music, despite his somewhat conservative style. So like, yeah, if we got any Mendelssohn fans out there, like in the middle of composing me an angry message, I just want them to chill the fuck out about that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so, and the other thing to just sort of say is just kind of like a bit of background on this is that this is not something that's specific to Germany, right? I mean, this is something that is an element of the right wing all across Central and Western Europe. Anywhere that Jews have been liberated, there is an emergent anti-Semitism on the right wing. It's most pronounced actually in France rather than in Germany at this point. It's politically mobilized fairly effectively in Germany for a period, but in France it's politically motivated straight to the end of World War II. And so Wagner's not particularly special in that regard. That he was anti-Semitic is almost to be assumed on the basis of where he sat politically, generally speaking. That he was vocal about it is probably really what distinguished him. And yeah, it was racial to some extent because he didn't view the distinction as being a religious one. But it's not really until a guy like Chamberlain comes along that there are people sort of theorizing a racial war as being at play here, and it's and that's because he has a direct influence on Wagner's daughter, and by extension, his son, her wife, and then their children into the generation that follows. It's really it goes on for a long time. It gets extended throughout the generations, really, in that family. Probably, as you already pointed out, not really primarily by Wagner himself, but rather through these influences that come into the family that decide to sort of take whatever it is that they can take from Wagner's ideas and use them to their own ends.
In any case, getting back to Houston Stuart Chamberlain, as near as I know, Tim's, it's basically accepted that he, while incredibly influential among the Nazis and associated with the Wagners, is not really like reliably a conduit for Richard Wagner himself and his views. But it is, worth noting and incredibly interesting that, the Wagner name and family is early attached to the Nazis. And this is a legacy with which, frankly, the family has yet to really, confront in a way I think is reasonable. But anyway, moving on a bit, Winifred, of course, after Siegfried Wagner, Richard Wagner's son, dies, takes over Bayreuth and runs it for a few years. And the Nazis are really super into it. Like I said, Hitler's basically ordering people to go to it at some point. But we fast forward to the end of the war, which, spoiler, Hitler loses. But I don't know if you know this. Of his many, many, many crimes, this is by far not the worst. But Hitler actually had in his possession many of Wagner's original scores in his bunker in Berlin. And despite the pleadings of the Wagners themselves to please give us these scores, he did not, and they were destroyed in the final days of the war, unfortunately.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, really, really kind of sucks because of all the things he wrote, the scores are probably the best. a lot of the actual words kind of sucked ass.
Yeah.
But in any case, after the war, the Bayreuth Festival shuts down. And the Bayreuth Festival is, of course, like the Wagner legacy estate and festival where they put on a whole bunch of like Wagner works and opera productions and stuff. But after the war, of course, there's no time for that. So for about 5 years, it shuts down. In 1951, it reopens. Now, Winifred cannot run it anymore. A war court has said, I don't think so. You're too Nazi. And she and her family too. Look, I'm gonna be clear. I don't buy this bullshit, but this is what they say. She was never really into Nazis, and she really like hated the Holocaust and wasn't really into the party at all. She just really fucking loved Hitler.
Right.
Which, first of all, that ain't even that great a defense. Second of all, I don't buy that shit at all. Do you buy that shit? No,
man. I do not. I don't buy it about King Edward VIII and his wife, and I don't buy it about Henry Ford, and I don't buy it about her.
No, none of them, man. But in any case, so she can't run it no more. So her two kids run it. We're not gonna go through the whole fucking family tree because there are way too many Wagners, and Wagner himself had many children, and his descendants many children, multiple marriages too, and so that like it gets really actually like pretty complex. You want to trace down all the way to all the Wagners that are around, but I don't want to overgeneralize. Generally speaking, family's got some problems. For one thing, as near as I can tell, and I've looked to try to see if they've backtracked on this, and I don't think they have. They've still got like 20 years of correspondence between Winifred and Hitler that they will not let anyone see.
Yeah.
And let me make it clear, they were so close that after Winifred was widowed, people thought that she and Hitler might have been banging, and that and that maybe Hitler was going to marry her. And we literally do not know if that's true or not. It actually wouldn't. It seems kind of like it might be. actually. But I don't know. Do you know anything about where you come down on that? I don't know.
There's rumors about all kinds of things. I mean, the only he obviously he married Ava Brown, and he married her, like a day or two before they killed themselves. And he was involved with her for like the last 10 years of his life or something like that. But that's the only like known relationship with the woman that he had. There was talk about affairs here and there. In particular, like probably the most famous one was there was alleged to be an affair with his niece. But there's never been any proof. It's always been kind of like a rumor mill.
Yeah, I want to make that clear. There is no proof. Just rumors, not totally bullshit, unsubstantiated ones, but like, rumors at the time and they were incredibly close. That is absolutely a fact.
Yeah, in fact, Gottfried Wagner said, told us when I had lunch with him that she used to call him Uncle Wolf.
Yes. And actually like talk about him with the cryptic initials USA, which in German stood for like our beloved Adolf.
Yeah.
Something like this, which like, wow. Anyway, she lives till 1980. And even in the family, though, like they do still have some problems, they're not unified on this Nazi shit at all, as we'll talk about one of the more appropriate one of the more important Wagners alive today working on this stuff, who I think deserves some credit. But she was like, she lived until the 1980s. And she can, this is why I don't believe like, oh, she's not into Nazis or whatever. She received a parade of fascists from all over the fucking world at her goddamn house for decades, to the point where like even some of the more neutral Wagners were like, come on, man, can you please cut it out? Like this looks terrible.
It's like try to keep it on the down low.
like maybe just like 50% less fascist house visits. Like Jesus Christ, like a shitload of them. And to her dying day, she never recanted or regretted any of her relationship with the Nazis or with Hitler. However, as I said, family is not uniform at all. And there is one Wagner who is still incredibly pissed off about all of this. His name is Gottfried Wagner. I believe he still lives in Italy, where he is a musicologist and musical director. And Thames Darwin, you had the privilege to speak with him at some point, right?
I did. I had lunch with him. This is 15 or 20 years ago now. It's less than 20, but more than 15. I had lunch with him at the house of a rabbi in Philadelphia. A rabbi named, actually a fairly well-known rabbi named Brian Walt. He's South African rabbi, and he was one of the very vocal rabbi as a member of an organization called Rabbis for Human Rights. It's it fights for rights for the Palestinians in the occupied territories. And he had invited Gottfried to come to his synagogue and speak about the Wagner family, and then invited him back to his house for lunch. And the woman, I was dating the woman that was involved in setting up the meeting at the time for him to come to speak at the synagogue. So she brought me along to this lunch, and it was just Brian, me and her, and Gottfried, who had lunch together, and he sort of told this story of what it was like for him to come to terms with this, with the big problem in his family of all these Nazis. And so he basically sort of presented it as being a fairly typical experience that a lot of Germans had in the 1960s of his generation, where they were coming of age in the mid to late 60s, and they were finding out about the war crimes and all of these things for the first time, and they were turning to their parents and saying, well, what were you doing? What was going on in our family when all of these terrible things were happening? And the responses were either denials, just outright denials, or the refusal to engage in it at all.
Yeah,
and so
a lot of feet shuffling, I'd say.
Yeah.
I just want to interrupt. I'm sorry to say,
sure.
it's just an incredibly important point to extrapolate that the Wagners, though they are like very famous and influential in Germany, the problem that they're facing is not singular or unique. There were lots of German families who all had to come to terms with this.
And sure. Yeah, I mean, and in fact, just to give you some example, I mean, the woman that brought me to this lunch, I mean, she's, German and, descended from German family on both sides, going back as far as she can tell. And on her father's side, they were party members. And on her mother's side, they were actually members of the resistance. And that was a much more rare thing in Germany to be part of the resistance, though. I mean, it was a much more common thing to have family members, not necessarily who were in the party or who were actually complicit, but who, at the very least, just sort of went along with everything.
Yes.
And so the accusation that somebody like Gottfried Wagner would make of his parents was like, how could you not say something like, didn't it outrage your sense of right and wrong to, see Jews being pulled out of their apartments and brought to train stations and shipped off to nowhere and you never saw them again? I mean, you tell me that, that you were told by the government that they were just going someplace else, but, you never saw them again. So you must have known something bad had happened. And the difference, obviously, was that that his family, Gottfried's family, were members of the elite, and so the denials would just sort of fall much more flat than they would in most other cases. And there was a lot of revolutionary activity in Germany at the time in the late 60s that this was happening, some of which was happening as a direct reaction to a whole generation of silence after the war and refusal to talk about these things and really sort of come to terms with them. And what was actually happening in the 60s that contributed to this to a very large extent was that West Germany was putting on its first public trials of war criminals.
Yes.
Yeah, so all of this was sort of coming, and plus the Eichmann trial had happened at the beginning of the 60s, so that had brought out a lot of this stuff. And then when Germany began putting on its own trials, then it was in the front pages of the papers every day. And so and then, so Gottfried begins to interrogate his parents, and that sort of gets the ball rolling on how things end up.
Yeah, and he will basically become estranged from basically his entire family, as near as I can tell, most of them anyway.
Yeah.
When his father died, I think in 2001, it was early 2000s, he had to read about it in the paper. Nobody called him. He was not allowed to see his father, who he was estranged from, and yet probably would have gone to his bedside at his deathbed, because he had first privately, I imagine, and then very publicly, began to challenge his father and the rest of his family for not adequately confronting the degree to which they didn't just not do anything, and they didn't just keep their heads down. They helped a good bit, I'd say. Obviously they didn't change the world, win the war, or anything like that, but they were on board with Hitler and what he was doing. And Gottfried was looking back on he's not dead, I'm sorry. But I imagine he looks back on this still to this day, and feels shame not in himself, but in the rest of his family who have not really looked this legacy in the eye.
Yeah, and I think that's what really sort of drove him more than anything else. It wasn't, again, that he had family that were, members of the party or that had connections to people that were in power wasn't that unique. But at the same time, their sort of steadfast refusal to engage any of it, particularly given the public profile of the family within Germany right up to the present day, just infuriated him basically. And he was basically saying to them this is an ideology that destroyed our country. I mean, never mind all the other people, which obviously were awful and we need to take account of. But I mean, it destroyed the country as well. So this is really something that we need to make a public accounting of. And they were just like, no way. Because most of them, in his telling of it, most of them were just absolutely unapologetic about their affiliation, and that they were still pretty die hard in their beliefs. right down to his father, who he was like a teenager during the war. His father.
In terms of Bayreuth, when they were looking for a new director, though Gottfried would have absolutely been an excellent candidate as a Wagner and a musician at the time when they were looking, it was never ever going to happen, let alone even be considered, because that festival to this day remains in the hands of less enlightened Wagners than Gottfried. Gottfried still works in Italy, I believe, and I believe he directs basically he's the boss of a whole theater, and so like all the musical productions, operas, and everything that goes on there, he's doing that. I know he's also trained as a musicologist, which I've told people before what that is, but basically, if you don't know, it's an anthropologist for music. You study music on a scholarly level. Music historians would fall into this category. Some people would even consider musical education to be a type of musicology. I was not really taught that in school, but that's one view anyway. On the other hand, though, there is a, if not quite as bad a mistake, there is and so not equal and opposite, there still is a somewhat opposed mistake that you can make in terms of the Wagner legacy, and it's the state of affairs in the state of Israel today regarding Wagner's music. Actually, I don't know if you're familiar with this at all.
Well, I know that it's been deeply controversial, obviously, the entire time that Israel has existed. But I thought that I remember reading something that they had performed Wagner there for the first time in the last decade.
Here's the thing. Near as I've looked, and so things might have changed relatively recently, but back in the 30s, before Israel was a thing, there's a Palestine orchestra, and this orchestra will become the Israeli National Orchestra, so it's the same contiguous body, just because it's called the Palestinian Orchestra. Don't want to give everybody the wrong idea. They played Wagner, no big deal. It was never, they were never worried about it. It was just, he's part of the canon, in other words. And so you play him because he's part of the canon. However, after the modern state of Israel comes into being, to my knowledge, never has an entire Wagner opera been staged in the state of Israel.
I'm actually looking at this now. I remember, so this is what I had heard. It was announced in 2012 that they were going to do it, but again, because of protests, it never happened.
Yeah, so the thing is, like, there's no law that says you can't play Wagner in Israel or anything like that, but you basically can't play Wagner in Israel, at least not at a public performance. A few times, there have been a few times where instrumental works have been played. I am not unbiased. I absolutely admit this. I'll say that straight up right now, because I've devoted years of my life that I'll never get back to the study of this music. And so for someone to be like, oh, well, we're just not going to play it because he was an asshole, and a particularly like anti-Semitic and like outspoken asshole, that's ridiculous to me. It would be one thing if his work was actually anti-Semitic, but like the instrumental shit, first of all, you can't even make that argument, okay? And a lot of the operas, a lot of it's in the staging, which, I think, even old music should not be dead, and it should, be infused with new life, new takes, new creativity, if you will. Wagner himself rewrote scores because he thought they made them better. This is, kind of taboo, but it did infuse some much needed life into music at the time. And we could do the same thing with his operas. Indeed, Bayreuth at times has done this. It's gone up and down sort of as an artistic festival, but to my mind, and I'm not really into opera much at all, but to my mind, their more successful productions and years have been when they have not just done the same old Wagner the same old way every year, and instead have allowed new directors to come in with new ideas, new takes, new staging, new lights, all that stuff, and give it something new, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, in Israel, they're so far behind that culturally because they can't even grapple with the music as it exists. Like I said, I'm absolutely biased, but I think this is bullshit. You're not a musician. Do you think this is bullshit?
Well, it's bullshit, but it's part of a larger like pattern in Israel with regard to Germany generally, which is like, Israel didn't have public relations with like open diplomatic relations with Germany for about 10 years. And during that period, there was a lot of sort of back channel contacts because West Germany in particular was really eager to reach out to Israel to support it very heavily as a way of kind of like assuaging its guilt over what had happened during the war. But and so one of the ways that this manifested during the 1950s was in reparations, right? I mean, Germany pays out reparations to Holocaust survivors for lost property, for loss of of relatives' lives, and things like that. And this was really controversial. Like when it was the came time for the parliament there, the Knesset, to vote on a reparations bill, it passed by one vote. And it only passed by one vote because some of the people that were protesting against it had threatened to burn the Knesset building down at what they called blood money. And so they were in prison. They were in jail. And they said they were in jail and couldn't vote. And actually, the protesters were led by Menachem Begin, who became prime minister in the 1970s. So, and he was a Holocaust survivor. So, I mean, it gives you some idea of what was motivating his particular animus, right? I mean, so the idea that anybody would speak German in Germany, like, to give you another example, like, when Eichmann was tried in Jerusalem in 1961, the three judges that were the tribunal that tried him were all first language German speakers. They had all been born in Germany and educated in Germany, and but nobody wanted to volunteer to translate for Eichmann between Hebrew and German for a bunch of reasons, but one of which was that nobody wanted to speak German. And finally, the three judges that were on the tribunal, they were so frustrated by the fact that the translation that Eichmann was getting was so bad, was in fact getting in the way of his getting a fair trial, that they just cross-examined him directly in German. And that was a big deal because, like, that was the language of the oppressor. You don't speak German in Israel. Like, that's it's a taboo. And so part of the Wagner thing goes along with that, with this whole sort of rejection in Israel, particularly in the first couple of generations, of anything having to do with Germany. Yeah, and the other part of it is like sort of coming to terms with it. Like you point out, he's part of the canon. I mean, and so to consider yourself to be a fully educated person with regard to 19th century Romantic music, you have to come to terms with Wagner. It's like, my educational background is in American literature, and one of the major poets of 20th century American literature is Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was a fascist. He was, he literally was tried for treason because he was broadcasting from Italy during the war, telling in English, broadcasting to American GIs and British GIs, telling them that they shouldn't be fighting a war for the Jews, and they bring him back to the United States. They put him on trial. They find him not guilty by reason of insanity. They throw him into a mental institution for 15 years or something like that. He finally gets out. He goes back to Italy. He never renounces points of view. But what are you going to do? You're going to not teach Ezra Pound? He's like one of the most important poets of the 20th century. And as a patron of other poets, he's bar none. He's the most important poet of the first half of the 20th century. I mean, so you have to come to terms with him, which means, you engage his work. You don't engage his work and, as well as his politics, or not engage the negative political aspects of what either one of these men were about. But I mean, but they're there. They had real influence, and you need to engage them from an artistic standpoint at the very least.
And in terms of Wagner, I don't find it persuasive, but I should let people know that there are some people who make a case that a lot of his stuff is, particularly like in his operas, has a left-wing point of view. There is a plot device in one of his operas where the god of gods basically forces two titans to build him a mansion so opulent that he himself cannot afford it, which rings a bit anti-capitalist to my ear.
Yeah.
And there are other things like that. In addition, like the exile that he was suffering politically that during his lifetime before the unification of Germany was because of his participation in the failed revolutions of 1848 and 1849.
Yeah.
And that project of German nationalism at the time, it wasn't a foregone conclusion yet how left or right a project that was going to be. Now it turns out Bismarck is the one who does it, and Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, is a clearly conservative right-wing figure, and so that is the terms under which like the German Empire will begin. But before that, it wasn't so clear cut, I'd say.
Yeah, I would say further, it wasn't even all that clear cut afterward. It's not really until World War I that there's a clean break made in Germany, and not just in Germany, but in virtually every other country in Europe, between nationalism on one hand and socialism on the other. Where there's because when the war breaks up in 1914, one of the first sort of cracks in the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the SPD, which still is the oldest social democratic party in Europe. That crack is caused by the refusal rather of the majority of the members of the SPD to renounce the war. There's a left-wing faction within the SPD that breaks off because they don't want to go to war because they see it as a capitalist exploit, at the expense of labor who are being fight. But the SPD see themselves as patriotic Germans, and their nationalism, for the way that they see it, is really not to be questioned. It's not until the end of the war, when the defeat gets hung around their necks, that they are able to see that they were wrong. Really, I mean, and it's the same split happens within the Social Democratic Party in Russia. It's with Lenin being on the left, the Zimmerwald left, that breaks off on the basis of being against the war. That's so. I really don't. You're absolutely correct. I mean, Bismarck is this very sort of old school right wing reactionary kind of figure. But he is the standard bearer for German nationalism. But there's a significant amount of German nationalism on the left that is just as important, I think, until World War I.
Yeah, it's definitely not as clear how things are going to shake out. And I think a lot of, Wagner's coloring and really it's absolutely fair, because late in his life, he did not mellow out. He got worse. And he wrote more about this stuff, actually. I did mention the one article, Jewishness in music, but that's not the only thing he wrote about Jews. He wrote some other pretty fucking gross stuff that again was never super popular or influential when he was alive or by the Nazis, but it was enough to associate him and his descendants with this anti-Semitism, and that's a legacy that we should never forget. Certainly, whether we are Wagners or not, I'd say.
Yeah.